Awakening Our Divine Potential, Part 2. And it's choosing our inner template for life. How many of us have had a moment in our lives when we suddenly became aware of what we think of ourselves? When we suddenly have this awareness of, oh my gosh, I believe that? Oh my gosh, where did that come from? In that moment, we gain a vision of ourselves acting out of a belief system that many of us didn't even know was part of us. Now, part of it could be what we were, even the Fiona Project, is when suddenly women realize that they have had these abuse situations, and that's a challenging moment of that. But it can also be an even milder, when suddenly we recognize that we have been, have this inner template that we have built for ourselves, defining ourselves, and that we're operating from it, but are totally oblivious that it even exists. It can be just a belief that we don't know where it came from. Sometimes I'm a certified hypnotherapist myself, and sometimes we were regressing people, and we would go back to the cause, and it could be something very, very minor. But in our children's mind, our child's mind, we drew a conclusion about ourselves, and we've lived from that without ever realizing if it was accurate or not. The one that always comes to my mind is when I regressed a lady, and she kept wondering why she always was putting herself second, why she was always putting herself behind everyone else. And I remember when I brought her out of hypnosis, she looked at me and then she went, "Pennies? Pennies? This is all about stupid pennies?" And I thought, okay, would you share the story with me? She said, well, yeah. She said when she was a little girl, she went over to visit her grandmother. And her older brother had a coin collection. And the grandmother had been saving pennies for him to see if he wanted to add any to his penny collection. And when she got there, she wanted to play with the pennies, but the grandmother said, no, he gets to go through them first because he has the collection. Well, in her child's mind, she interpreted that as, I'm always second best. I'll never be chosen first. I'm always going to be behind, to be behind men, behind anyone she perceived to being bigger or more powerful. And then, you could see that there was nothing malicious about it. It was just a factual thing that happened. But this child at the age of 4 or 5 chose an idea about herself that she had been living with throughout her life. And here she is in a 40-something body, still acting out from that decision she made as a 4-year-old. What's more amazing about that, because what was interesting is she couldn't move for a little while. And she just said when she realized that she had devoted so much energy into this idea that it was like energetically in her body. It was like a body memory that she had. And she said, I can't walk for a little while. It's like we built this infrastructure based on our beliefs. And when one of those beliefs changes, we go weak for a while. Our bodies, it just seems like we kind of collapse a little bit until we can kind of reevaluate and process and regroup. I was taking a prosperity class years ago from Carol, as a matter of fact. And I discovered that I was reading through the material, and I discovered I had this belief about prosperity. And it was stupid. It was totally stupid. But I realized how much I had invested in me in that belief. And I was like this lady. I couldn't walk. I was just like, all this energy had just drained out of me. And what was so funny is I called my husband and I told him what was happening. And he felt so sorry for me that he ordered a basket of Godiva chocolate to be delivered to the church. Now, chocolate will heal anything, right? Am I right? Yeah, especially Godiva chocolate. And but when he told his boss what he was doing, she was so thrilled at what he was doing that she paid for half of the order. I thought that was totally cool. But I still remember that weakness that I felt. It was like that infrastructure inside of me had shifted. I also saw that same reaction when I was teaching a Bible class. And there was a student that I had, a young man, and I could tell he had really studied the Bible and was very serious about it. But when I started explaining historically the time periods that the Bible was really written in, it really shook him up, because he kept thinking it was being written at the time all these things were happening. And I said, no, no, no. I mean, one of the most startling questions for people is, what is the earliest text in the New Testament? It's the letters of Paul. Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not come until, and John did not come until 70 or 80 years after Jesus was even on the planet. And that's when I started thinking, well, you think if Paul was the earliest one to do any writing, he might have mentioned a miraculous birth or a miraculous death, but he doesn't say anything about it. All that came 70 and 80 years after Jesus was on the planet. And it really kind of had to reevaluate a lot of my thinking about where those stories came from. But this young man was the same way, because he looked up at me in a kind of bewildered way, and he said, I can't move. And I said, well, let's just take a break, because I could tell he was very serious about his studies, but he had, it really shook him up. Maybe you've experienced this, I don't know, but I've seen this so many times, that we have built an energy field within our being based on beliefs that we have chosen for ourselves. We are here to grow in our understanding of who we are and how we relate to the world. I was privileged a few years ago to be part of a group that supported each other in creating these actual shifts. Many of you may remember the self-exploration movements of the 70s and the 80s. Maybe you participated in them. I know I did. EST and LifeSpring, or just a few of the many programs that were out there. I was still in the business world, and so I took a program called the Competitive Edge, which applied many of these same principles of self-exploration into the business setting. Well, what was so neat that it was held here in Atlanta, and a group of us got together and we created a support group that met weekly to continuing supporting each other and practicing and implementing the principles that we were learning in the course. Our group lasted for actually 2 years after the initial training. So it was a very, very powerful group. And there was about 12 of us. And we became very, very close. And I always remember one meeting that we had. We would state what principle we were working on, and then each member of the group would individually support that person and their request as we went around the circle. At this one particular meeting, a man stated that he had the challenge with being obnoxious. He said it just seemed to pop out of him. He asked us to tell him when he was becoming obnoxious so that he could make efforts to change his behavior. The first person in the circle began, I hear your request, and I honor what you are working on, and I will not tell you when you're becoming obnoxious. The man looked absolutely dumbfounded. And then we went to the next person. I hear your request, and I honor what you're working on, and I will not tell you when you're becoming obnoxious. He was not getting the response he was expecting. One by one, each person in the circle repeated the same words. I hear your request, and I honor what you're working on, and I will not tell you when you're becoming obnoxious. I watched as this man went from confusion, his face became red, and then slowly he moved into bewilderment. He could not understand this group of people that he'd gotten so close to, each saying the same thing over and over. By the time they got around to me, he was crying softly, but he still stayed in his chair. Just about 3/4 of the way around the circle, I saw the light dawn in his eyes. He stopped the next person, quietly asked them to say, would you support me in my realizing when I become obnoxious? And the whole group said, yes. And it was, I mean, I applauded him because he could have walked away. He was so taken aback by what everyone was saying, yet he did not move. He stayed and he stuck with it because he was so determined to make the changes that he wanted to make. And it was one of the more powerful groups that I think I've ever been in, because we really were very honest and upfront with each other, yet very loving and very supportive. Each of us may have had a moment, just like we talked about when I did part one of this. We talked about Jesus and Moses and Buddha and Muhammad. It's a moment that becomes a surrender point. We becoming willing to let go of who we believed we were to embrace the person that we are here to become. Each stage is a point of spiritual awakening. Each point tests a person's faith that something greater is happening here, and it's time to evolve. It's time to become something more than we have been. Jesus in the desert, Buddha under the Bodhi tree, Moses with the burning bush. Each faced a test to see if he had faith in God, or you can call it divine law or principle, something that would take them beyond who they had been up to that point. Each one was tested repeatedly, not just a spiritual test, but some very human opposition also happened for them. Pharaoh did not go along with Moses, and yet they'd been raised together, and they became adversaries. Jesus was not accepted by the leaders of the temple, which he kind of expected. But when his own neighbors in Nazareth tried to throw him off of a cliff, when he gave it a new interpretation of Isaiah, you can imagine he was pretty shaken up by that. When you have your friends and neighbors turn on you, when you're trying to share this evolution that you're experiencing, we're no different than any of them. We are on a spiritual learning process with assignments that explore our relationship with external power and our own internal power, and how to use both. One of the books that I really enjoy, came out a few years ago, was Carolyn Mace. Have you all read Sacred Contracts? It's a book I found very, very interesting and very, very enlightening. And she was talking about this, that each of us work from this inner template, or she calls them archetypes, for survival. Sometimes we've had to adopt these things just to survive in the world, but each archetype, excuse me, has a shadow side and it also has an effective side. We may not be aware of how we find ourselves using these templates. We mainly choose them during our formative years. But together, they represent the issues, the fears, the vulnerabilities that cause us to define how we use our own personal power, or how we react to power. Do we give them away, or do we use them as spiritual strengths for dealing with our life issues? The four of them that I chose and kind of paraphrased a little bit are the child, the victim, the slave, and the saboteur. Each has a shadow side and has an effective side, depending on how we have learned to use these templates. She describes more, but these are the four that I think are kind of the basic ones. Let's look at the child. The core issues are dependency versus responsibility. When do we take responsibility for ourselves? And when do we have a healthy dependency on someone else? The man in the circle made his breakthrough moving from you do it to help me do it. He accepted his own power instead of depending on others to do it for him. I know for myself, I was always the person in the family that was taking care of mom or dad or my husband when he was dying. Then to find myself sick, I didn't know how to be on the receiving end of that. But fortunately, I had a girlfriend that stepped up to the plate, and she was there for me. But I had to learn how to accept someone else guiding me, is to use both and recognize when each one is being effective in our lives. It's also when do we stand up to the group And when do we embrace the group life, whether that group are friends or family? Each of us must make that choice. The victim, the core issue, is to evaluate our relationship to power. The power others have versus the power we have. The key is learning how to have healthy personal boundaries. So many of us never learned that we even had a boundary. Many times we had parents that didn't know they had boundaries either. So they go walking all over everybody else's because they're not recognizing that these are necessary, healthy parts of our life. So often it is all or nothing. I remember one Sunday after church when I was at Unity North, a lady came up to me in absolute tears. And I took her into my office. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "My husband is blaming me for everything that's going wrong in his life. He got up late and was late for work, and his boss got angry at him, and it's all my fault. And he just always seems to be doing this. He's always blaming me." And I said, "Well, since he's giving his power over to you, why don't you just claim it? And why don't you just say, well, yeah, I made sure you got up late. I made sure you were late. I even made sure your boss got angry at you. And guess what I'm going to do to you tomorrow?" She had this shocked look on her face. And then she just thought, or she looked at me and she goes, "You know, I'm going to go out and kick some spiritual butt." And she stood in her power. And she realized that if he's giving his away, why not just take it? Maybe he would wake up to the fact that he was responsible for his own life, and it wasn't hers at all. But she, on the other hand, had to learn to set that boundary for herself as well. Then there's the slave, and the core issue is how much of your morals, your integrity, your intellect, your honesty, your body or your soul are you willing to give up for the sake of physical security? Benjamin Franklin, my favorite founding father, said that those that give up their freedom for security deserve neither freedom nor security. The powerless slave has an absence of choice. How many times, I even hear on television shows, people say, "I had no choice but to commit this crime. I had no choice." And really, we have to realize we always have a choice. We always have the ability to recognize that there is another way of doing it. Let me get a glass of water here. Have you ever felt that way? That I never had a choice? Well, it's examining what kind of choice maybe do you have. Sometimes it could even be a choice to do nothing, but it's still a choice. Sometimes it could even be to surrender to a divine power, or use, this is where our faith comes in. If I don't know, I always tell my husband, well, this is plan A. Do we have a plan B? And if the answer was no, then it was like, well, let's stick with plan A. But if a plan B comes up, let's get ready to look at that too. So it's recognizing, for me at least, that there was always a choice available. I may not be able to see it in the moment, but at least I was being aware that it would be coming up. So it's just recognizing when you can use that choice and when you can't, and be at peace with both. The other is the saboteur. The core issue is fear of inviting change into your life versus our ability to handle change. I mean, how many of us heard the one constant in our life is that things will change? The saboteur is the mirror that reflects our fears of taking responsibility for ourselves and for what we create. The saboteur also invites us to look at our inner guidance during times of change. So let's take a look. What would these all look like in application? Let's suppose we're walking down a path that we have chosen for ourselves, and suddenly a train cuts off our path. The child can either become terrified It's so big and I'm so small, help me, I can't. Or it's a train. I've been learning about trains. Maybe I can get the man in the caboose to pull the whistle. The victim. Why is there always a train? The trains are out to get me. Or another train. Isn't it time I learned what to do with trains? The slave. I can't deal with trains. I better go on someone else's path. I'll support their path. They don't have any trains over there. Or, it's only a train. I'm still standing here. It's only a temporary delay. The saboteur. If I pick this path, there are so many trains that I won't have to get where I'm going and I won't have to deal with success. Or, I know there are trains. Let's use each one as a brake so I won't have to move too fast on my path. I can use the time to adjust to my changes. We also have the option, always, to move into our faith. Jesus said to his disciples, all this you can do and more if you have faith. Buddha told his disciples, be lamps unto yourselves. Muhammad said, ask guidance from Allah, and Allah will guide you. Awakening our divine potential is allowing our faith that God knows where we are on our path and is right here with us. Excuse me just a second. I get excited about this stuff. Awakening our divine potential is allowing our faith that God knows where we are on our paths and is right here with us, by whatever name you call God. It's when we turn to our own inner guidance, acting with faith, that we live from our highest potential. God has the big picture as to what we are about. God is aware of the beginning of the train and when the train will end. Maybe God is even the train. Oh, Lord. Let's go into meditation.